You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
Thank you so much for taking the time from your busy, beautiful day, actually, to be indoors with us today. We are honored by having you here. My name is Shams Ghonaim. I'm the chair of the Iowa City Human Rights Commission. And as far as the introduction, actually, what I want to say that this event was put together by the commissioners, thought of several months ago, in light of what has been going on in the exchanges between candidates during the presidential campaign and actually other campaigns, because we're also having Senate, Congress, representatives all across the board. And what we hope to accomplish is to say we are all in it together. Republicans, Democrats, independents, black, whites, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, persons with different abilities. We are all together and we must stay together and be each other's allies. We need to heal from this campaign, regardless of who wins, because there is a shadow after the campaign. Unfortunately, that may stay with us for some time to come. So I'm honored today to introduce the Honorable former Congressman James Leach. Mr. Leach is an American academic and former Republican congressman representing Iowa for 30 years in the U.S. Congress. He's a graduate of the London School of Economics and Political Science, Johns Hopkins University, and Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Council on Foreign Relations, and formerly served as a trustee of Princeton University. He joined the University of Iowa College of Law in 2014 and is currently the chair in public affairs, visiting professor of law, and senior scholar. Most recently, he served as the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities as its 9th chair from 2009 to 2013. Under his leadership at the NEH, a Bridging Culture program was created, designed to promote understanding and mutual respect for diverse groups within the United States and abroad. As part of this effort, NEH supported programs designed to expand citizen understandings of American history and values, the civil rights movement, and foreign cultures. In addition, the agency helped launch a national digital public library to establish a unified gateway to digital collections of books, artworks, and artifacts from libraries, museums, and other cultural sites across the country. Mr. Leach presided over the culmination of decades-long projects, such as the publication of the autobiography of Mark Twain and the Dictionary of American Regional English. In his long years of service in Congress, he chaired many committees, such as the Banking and Financial Services, Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, and the Congressional Executive Committee on China. Following his time in Congress, he was a professor at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University and interim director of the Institute of Politics and lecturer at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He holds 13 honorary degrees, has received decorations from 2 foreign governments, and is the recipient of the Wayne Morse Integrity in Politics Award and the Adlai Stevenson Award from the United Nations, the Edgar Wayburn Award from the Sierra Club, the Norma Burlock Public Service Award, and the Woodrow Wilson Medal from Princeton. He has served on the board of several public companies and a series of nonprofit organizations, including the Century Foundation, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Catering Foundation, ProPublica, and Common Cause, which he chaired. It's my honor to introduce Mr. Leach.
Well, thank you, Shams. I'm honored to be with you and embellish this town with your leadership. Thank you. What I intend to do this afternoon is address the challenges of building bridges of civility and tolerance by referencing aspects of American history and contemporary politics. Today, America has extraordinary leadership in almost every field of human endeavor. from business and technology to the arts, various professions, and the academy. Unfortunately, the notable leadership exception is politics. Both political parties are letting the country down. Even when an impressive candidate or two emerge, the system has become so money-intensive and attitudinally distraught that legalized conflicts overwhelm the public interest. President Eisenhower warned years ago of a military-industrial complex. Today, my worry is about the rise of a political ideological complex. Ideologues use politicians as pawns, while politicians use ideologues, especially those with deep pockets, as enablers of personal ambition. This reinforcing set of mutual interest has little to do with the common good and much to do with the breakdown in civility in public life. For many, concern for civility seems either unimportant or sanctimonious. Actually, civility is an enduring virtue of civilized society through the ages. At issue is how individuals interact in community and how societies make decisions that can affect their place in relationship to all others. Civility is not simply or principally about manners. It doesn't mean that spirited advocacy is to be avoided. Indeed, argumentation is a social good. Without argumentation, there's a tendency to dogmatism and even tyranny. What civility does require is a willingness to consider respectfully the views of others with an understanding that we're all connected and rely on each other. The electoral process is more than what happens on election day. It's also about what happens between elections. To paraphrase Clausewitz, lawmaking is a continuation of politics in another form. Electoral politics never stops. It is just interrupted every year or two to count ballots. While civility and politeness are not synonymous, words and the manner they are expressed do matter. After all, how issues are addressed affects how they are resolved. For those who have ever studied physics, you might recall that Sir Isaac Newton postulated 3 laws of nature, the last of which is that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Two decades ago, I like to suggest to myself that I discovered what I described as the 4th Newtonian law from observations made on the House floor. One day, the then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, an unusually gifted member from Georgia, gave a blistering critique of the Democratic Party's position on an issue. As I was watching the indignant reaction of friends on the Democratic side, it suddenly dawned on me that in social physics, unlike natural physics, reaction can sometimes be greater than action. Bitterness begets greater bitterness. Statesmen and military strategists through the ages have noted the danger of pressing an opponent too deeply in a corner where irrational lashing out becomes the only alternative. Offensive words can have a similar effect. They too easily lead to wars of other kinds. In the new century, when for the first time terrorism has been globalized and warheads with unprecedented power have been widely proliferated, the need for listening carefully to friend and foe has never been more important. The implications of Einstein's sobering observation that splitting the atom has changed everything except our way of thinking must be factored in to all geopolitical discussions. Seldom, after all, is there only one proper path determinable by one individual, one political party, or one ideological movement. Over most of our history, our democratic processes operated under this assumption. The art of politics was considered the art of compromise. What is so awkward in governance today is that the art of politics has increasingly become the art of intransigence. If a congressman or senator, for instance, brooks party discipline on an issue, she risked a primary challenge from a competitor who will be well-funded and will argue that party needs a real conservative or a real liberal to represent the district or state. St. Paul once observed that we all look through a glass darkly. Metaphorically, Paul may have made the ultimate case for humility. While faith may be absolute, Paul suggests that man simply doesn't have the capacity to know the will of God or perfectly the wisdom of his apostles on earth. An analogous lack of certitude should be applied to political judgment. Whether a person knows a great deal or very little, caution should be made about being certain of very much. To know a lot may be preferable condition to knowing little, but the best and the brightest are not immune from great mistakes. Imperfect judgment characterizes the human condition. That is why humility is such a valued character trait and why civility is such an important part of an interconnected world polity. As individuals, each of us tries to make a sense of our own odysseys through life. Our universe is small in relation not only to the solar system, but the communities in which we live. But wherever we might be, we're affected by global events, whether related to the challenges of national security or the global hiring hall. In the jungle of modern politics, there is an increasing tendency for politicians to pontificate about what ails the body politic, the way medicine men at 19th century county fairs peddled elixirs which they claim could cure pains of the human body. Modesty is not a hallmark of public life, but a wise politician reins in overconfidence. There's no metaphor about anything happening today there. The story of America began with the faith-based values of the Puritans, who aspired to build a city on a hill. They began construction of such a city, and succeeding generations worked to enlighten it with tolerance. Recognizing frailties in human nature, our founders put an individual rights manifesto, the Bill of Rights, into the Constitution. The First Amendment's prohibition against establishing a state religion was critically important to the fledgling citizenry of the American Republic, not only because of the religious wars in Europe, which many of the colonists chose to escape, but because 11 of the original 13 colonies at one time or another had designated a state church. The two exceptions were Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, the latter of which was initially settled by immigrants fleeing the strictures of the early settlers in Massachusetts, where Quakers were hung and stocks and pillories used to shackle heretics and the morally tainted. In early Virginia, then Orthodox were threatened with fines, with whippings, and according to a 1612 law, the possibility of a bodkin being thrust through the tongue. In Maryland, Catholicism was the original state church. Then, when Protestants became more numerous in Baltimore, the city fathers issued a decree that no Catholic church could be built as high as that of the Episcopal Cathedral. Deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinkers in Europe, the founders were moral philosophers as well as political activists. Who does not see, Madison warned, that the same authority which can establish Christianity and exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians and exclusion of all other sects. Later, in an 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut, Jefferson poignantly affirmed the precept of a wall separating church and state. A deist, he may have been the only founder to study deeply comparative religion. He concluded that what mattered most was not where the great religions of the world differed, but where they conjoined. And by the way, when the first Muslim congressman was elected to Congress, the Librarian of Congress, Jim Billington, presented him the Quran in Jefferson's library to place his hand on when he was sworn in. Jefferson was a reader and a thinker. Religion-based meaning as a faith system, religion holds meaning as a faith system and as a code of behavior. The Ten Commandments, for instance, which are elements of the Judaic, Christian, and Islamic faiths, are a mixture of duties of the faithful regarding a relationship with God on the one hand and with people on the other. Likewise, the Golden Rule is a singular moral maxim that is a fundamental component of many of the great religions of the world and has antecedents as well in ethical maxims of the ancients. It can be expressed in the affirmative, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, for instance, which is the general Christian articulation, or in a more passive way, do not do unto others what one would not have done to oneself, which is closer to the Judaic and Confucian traditions. Other behavioral junctions are fundamental to all of the major faith systems. At the heart of Christianity, for instance, is the mandate to love thy neighbor as thyself. An analogous teaching, this one from the Quran councils, it may be that God will ordain love between you and those whom you hold as enemies. In like spirit, the Buddha advises contemplative self-restraint, and Hindus are enjoined in the Bhagavad Gita to be compassionate. For the sparse number of remaining Zoroastrians in the world, the principal bonds of community are considered to be love and friendship. In what may be the oldest monotheistic faith system, moderation remains a central Zoroastrian tenet. An anonymous author of a medieval Zoroastrian text observed, "Those things which moderation is not necessary are knowledge, friendship, and virtuousness." There's always a tension in a society such as ours that is based on firmly held ethical and religious values, but which protects diversity of thought as a fundamental right. Transforming this tension into positive political energy is the challenge of our constitutional system. Process is our most important product. To counter kingly despotism and ensure democratic accountability, our founders dwelled on the frailty of human nature and chose to bifurcate and decentralize political power. Following Montesquieu, they established a checks and balances system in which power was split between Congress, the executive, and the judiciary. The separation of powers was then repeated in similarly tripartite ways at state, county, and city levels, thereby causing creative tension between and within 4 levels of government. Civic virtue in America was not intended simply to relate to the establishment of institutional constraints on political authority. In the 55th Federalist paper, Madison noted, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities of human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Citizens were expected to supplement governmental actions with civic engagement." While the founders made clear that there was not to be a single established church or faith system, there was an expectation at the outset of our experiment with self-government that moral values springing from ethical and religious foundations would undergird the American Republic. Because duty to the Creator, in Madison's terms, precedes the claims of civil society, the state could not require a public official to conform to a particular religious creed. In turn, public officials were obligated not to impose particularistic views on private citizens. They were expected to practice their faith by example rather than with coercion, to be moral without moralizing, to be respectful of the convictions as well as the rights of others. Religion in the political history of man has seldom been so tolerantly conceived. Unfortunately, conception and implementation can be at odds, and the understanding of the role of faith in other societies has not been well understood, particularly by Americans. Not that we haven't been warned. Warnings of a blemished behavior, as well as descriptions of moral conduct, are embedded in the parables and exhortations associated with virtually all ethics and faith systems. According to the Bhagavad Gita, deterrents to a spiritual life include arrogance, anger, conceit, cruelty, hypocrisy, and ignorance. Similarly, preceding the Christian era, there developed over time a classification of vices termed the 7 deadly sins, and a parallel classification of virtues known as the 7 virtues. The vices, pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth, are matched by the virtues: humility, charity, chastity, kindness, temperance, patience, and diligence. These contrasting vices and virtues have been set forth for centuries by moral philosophers and religious authorities for individuals to consider as life presents inevitable choices of one kind or another. However, their relevance is magnified in political leadership because the decision-making of those in power can have significant ramifications for society as a whole. National security itself challenges shift over the centuries. Today, science has wrought weapons that make vulnerability the state of man everywhere. In a contemporary context, understandable controversy remains today about the manipulation of claimed intelligence used to rally support for intervention in Iraq, a country which had no part in 9/11. As wrong as WMD assessments and charges of Iraqi complicity in the attack on America proved to be, the bigger failure of intelligence was our lack of understanding of Islamic cultures and the role of religion in the life of peoples in the region. Half a century ago, Arnold Toynbee, one of the world's preeminent historians, based at the London School of Economics, gave a series of lectures at Grinnell College instructive on this point. In one presentation, for instance, Toynbee chastised the Russians for thinking that Karl Marx's theory of class struggle and economic determinism had historical validity. To consider Marxist dogma a guiding way to look at history was, in his judgment, simply false. In a gentler vein, Toynbee then warned Americans not to misunderstand the civil rights struggle so actively underway in the 1963. He acknowledged that civil rights problems were extremely important and must be thoughtfully addressed, but he wanted all to know that from an historical perspective, he did not consider it likely that racial differentiations would be a fundamental cause of war in the foreseeable future. Instead, he predicted that war would more likely break out as a consequence of religious differences than economic or racial distinctions. In the mid-1960s, such a predictive framework seemed out of touch with Cold War concerns. But in the aftermath of 9/11, Toynbee's concerns now appear undeniably prescient. We seem to have forgotten that at various points in our history, religious demagoguery tied to immigration was rampant. For instance, in the middle of the 19th century, the higher angels of human nature were for many citizens not evident. In 1836, Samuel F.B. Morse, the polymath who invented the Morse code and was the preeminent portrait painter of an era, ran unsuccessfully for mayor of New York on an anti-immigrant theme. Obsessed about the Catholic menace, Morse sought to plug the leak in the ship of state by limiting immigration from Catholic countries. At the same time, he called for banning followers of the papacy who had already arrived on our shores from holding public office. Opposition to immigrants, Catholics in particular, escalated in the 1850s as wars in Europe and the famine in Ireland precipitated a five-fold increase in immigration to the states compared to the prior decade. In rapid fashion, farmers and settlers in the West and abolitionists in New England abandoned allegiance to the Whig Party and came to identify either with the fledgling Republican Party taking shape in small rural communities in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan, or an angst-ridden anti-immigrant party which came to derisively be referred to as the Know-Nothings. The origin of the Know-Nothing tag derives from the initial meetings held as the party formed. Following the secrecy precedent of the Masons, those who attended initial organizing events were honor-bound to respond, "I know nothing," if a non-party member asked what happened at the meeting. Hence, the party's appellation stood as a put-down describing a political movement rooted in ignorance and insider maneuvering. The Know-Nothings garnered a large enough following that in the 1856 election, they were able to capture 21% of the presidential vote and play a decisive role in thwarting the electoral prospects of the first Republican presidential candidate, John C. Fremont of California. Fremont carried over a third of the Electoral College, but the presidency belonged to the Democratic candidate, James Buchanan. During Buchanan's controversial administration, the Supreme Court in 1857 issued the most repugnant ruling in its history, the Dred Scott decision, which held that dark-hued individuals could be bought and sold as property. In the second most troubling ruling in the court's history, Citizens United, a five-person majority employed inverted logic. Dred Scott held that a class of human beings could be considered property. Citizens United, on the other hand, implicitly holds that a class of property, that is a corporation, can be considered a human being, which the activist court majority thus claimed entitled it to First Amendment rights to speak with money in the political process. Lincoln used to reference Euclid's time-tested law that things equal to the same thing are equal to each other, to underscore that if a dark-skinned person is a man and a pale-skinned person is a man, they are equal to each other under the law. A corollary to Euclid would thus be that things not equal to the same thing are not equal to each other. This corollary is suggested because the First Amendment political rights that the court has ascribed to corporations exist only with linguistic gyrations. If a corporation is not a person and money is not speech, then it is sophistry to argue that corporations are people constitutionally entitled to spew unconstrained amounts of money on free speech grounds into the political process. In election years, this issue receives much attention for the implications for the balance between the political parties. The bigger concern is its ramification for democracy itself. No founder ever argued that corporations should be the American way. It is simply an unreasonable stretch for an activist Supreme Court to interpret the First Amendment in such a way as to weaken the voices of the people by empowering corporations to use corporate assets to steer America in a corporatist direction. A more credible linguistic and historical reading of the First Amendment would be that laws and implicitly government policies should not be promulgated that diminish the civic capacity of individuals not only to speak, but to be heard. Due to the pressure on our borders today from Mexico and the millions of refugees from the Middle East and Africa who are seeking asylum in safer countries, immigration concerns within destination countries have skyrocketed over the past several years. In our country, for instance, the reaction of xenophobic politicians who would ignore the Constitution and advocate religious tests at the border have clear echoes to the anti-immigrant phobia of the mid-19th century. Nativism, a bias against everyone not born in America, was not an answer a century and a half ago, nor is it an answer today. We err grievously if our borders are shut to all people of a given faith. We also err if we turn against those Muslims in this country who strive to become our neighbors in peace. National security may realistically require background checks on individuals seeking visas as they enter the United States, but it also requires recognition that excluding individuals based simply on the religion they embrace has counterproductive dimensions as well as constitutionality problems. If Muslims around the world come to view America as more a center of intolerance than beacon of hope, our capacity to maintain security at home and lead on a spectrum of international issues will be diminished. The bolting, for instance, of the American gate to all Muslims would play directly into the radical terrorist desire to spark conflict between religions as well as within the Muslim faith. The broad history of America has been one of welcoming immigrants and refugees who have added value and vibrancy in our economic and cultural life. Nonetheless, of soul-searching relevance are historical instances where fear, discrimination, and elements of hate have been interconnected, beginning with the killing and forceful displacement of Native Americans, enslavement of African Americans, the mistreatment of Chinese immigrants enticed into the country in the 19th century to help build our railroad infrastructure, the rampant anti-Catholicism that once characterized the attitudes of many Protestants, and the anti-Semitism poignantly reflected in the soulless refusal of the United States government in 1939 to allow the MS St. Louis, a merchant ship carrying 908 German refugees seeking to escape the Holocaust, the right to dock at an American port. 3 years later, in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor, our government evidenced fear of its own citizenry. By presidential decree, individuals of Japanese ancestry were uprooted from their homes and interned in camps for the length of the war. The country is American family writ large. Within the family, every parent at some point lectures a child to learn from his/her mistakes. A really smart person, it might be added, should learn from the mistakes of others. And a sage should learn from the wise as well as unwise acts that came before. The challenge today for America is not just to maintain a strong economy and military capacity, but to act sagely. We must learn from the best of our values and do our best to avoid repeating our errors. In this age of new and old-fangled violence, we cannot afford to succumb to the lower instincts of human nature. Just as asceticism is admirable, but not a natural instinct of man, the religious injunction to love or befriend an enemy is often beyond the emotional reach of human nature. But in a world in which outbreaks of violence and war itself have been a virtual constant in history, it is imperative that we have a fallback pattern of thinking to the more hallowed directives that have been the loftier behavioral guidance of various faith systems. As we deal with the other, tolerance rather than love may be the best we can achieve. While love is a spiritual ideal, advancing respectful tolerance for individuals and groups with whom we disagree may be the greatest challenge of our time, if not all ages. There are, of course, certain things such as hate and intolerance, untruth and hypocrisy, violence and aggression that are intolerable. But if a peaceful world is to be secured, each generation has a never-ending imperative to work to understand how others think and why they act as they do. Today, the American community is a mosaic of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, coupled with adherence to an assortment of other faith systems and secular codes of conduct. As a pluralist society, those of other faith and ethical systems are us, and we are them. In the face of globalized terrorism and an upsurge of displaced people around the globe, the only rational option is for citizens of all faiths and backgrounds to unite in mutual respect and understanding. We must stand together in what may be a long-term geopolitical turmoil, work to ensure that our communities are hate-free zones, and see to it that our relations with people outside our borders are respectful wherever and whenever possible. As Lincoln, citing scripture, warned a century and a half ago, a house divided against itself cannot stand. The same applies to our common home, Mother Earth. Thank you.
Our next speaker is our mayor. Mayor James Throgmorton is an emeritus professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Iowa, who has long been active in the public life of Iowa City. He first served as an elected member of its city council from late 1993 through 1995, and began serving again after being elected in 2011. Subsequent to being re-elected in 2015, he was elected the mayor of Iowa City. Many of his friends scratch their heads when they learn how he's been spending his retirement years. He has a BA in history from Notre Dame, an MS in community development from University of Louisville, and a PhD in urban and regional planning from UCLA. He taught urban planning at the University of Iowa for 24 years before retiring. His scholarly work has focused primarily on the roles of rhetoric and persuasive storytelling in planning, especially with regard to making city regions more just and ecologically sustainable. Please welcome Mayor Throgmorton.
Thank you, Shams. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and especially to share the stage with Jim Leach. Thank you so much, Jim, for all your words and all the work you've done in the past. So I understand that this event seeks to focus on ways to combat hate speech and fear-mongering tactics and rhetoric, perhaps by promoting dialogue and listening to voices that are often silent or silenced. Let me begin with free speech. Timothy Garton Ash offers 4 familiar arguments for it in a recent book entitled Free Speech, 10 Principles for a Connected World. Quote, "First, unless we can express ourselves freely, we will never know ourselves. We'll barely have selves to know. Selves are formed and found through give and take with others. Second, no-holds-barred discussion is the best way to find the truth, and limiting such discussion may prevent the emergence of truths. Third, free speech is essential to good government by exposing official misconduct and by enlisting the wisdom of the multitude. Fourth, hearing all voices teaches us to live with diversity in our cosmopolitan world," unquote. Well, free speech is under attack in much of the world. And yet, at the same time, vile, violent, and deceitful speech has never been more prevalent. All of this, Ash emphasizes, is complicated and exacerbated by the internet and social media. A quote from Ash, "The internet is," he claims, "history's largest sewer. Terrorist incitements are frequent, lies and disinformation abound, trolls and haters are everywhere." According to David Luban, who recently reviewed Ash's book in the New York Review of Books, Offensive speech constitutes a crucial test case for advocates of free speech. Ash insists we have no right not to be offended, and his advice is blunt: grow a thicker skin. As Jim Leach probably knows far better than I, elected officials need to grow pretty thick skins simply in order to retain sanity. But what about hate speech? Unlike personal insults or mockery of cherished ideas, Luban writes, hate speech incites hatred of people based on the basis of group membership, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexuality. The aim of laws against hate speech, he writes, is to ward off what Garton Ash calls a constant drip of dehumanizing abuse of particular groups of human beings. Such abuse, he warns, can eventually incline people to violence against that group. I was skimming through the New York Times yesterday. Forgive me for having done that. And you know, it's just appalling. It's heartbreaking to read through it. Horror after horror after horror. Just a relentless drip. Ash would ban such speech. Oh, and I also want to say, yesterday I was also reading the guest opinion page of the Press Citizen, and I noticed Shams Goname's excellent guest opinion in the paper, and I want to celebrate the great work that Shams has done over the years here in Iowa City. So Garton Ash would ban such speech only when violence associated with it is intended and likely and imminent. On this point, Ash identifies several factors that would increase the likelihood free speech will incite violent action: an influential speaker, a susceptible audience with grievances, a recognizable call to violence, a social setting conducive to violence, and an influential medium. I often feel like we're swimming in this kind of rhetoric at the moment. So in my own work as a scholar and as a elected public official, I have long believed it is important to use one's First Amendment right to advocate for what one values or what one believes to be true. But I try not to just blather away. I try very hard to begin by learning before I start talking about any particular topic. Beyond that, years of experience, too many, maybe, time passes, you know. Years of experience have taught me it is not possible to know what I truly think or value about the topic without testing my ideas against what other people think and value. Likewise, I strongly believe that in a well-functioning democracy, proposed policies and actions must be vetted through public debate. Done well, public debate gives us the opportunity to invent a better course of action than any one participant could imagine by her or himself. But I am very, very cautious about how I use the internet and social media as a means of debating in public. Here's how I do it. I distribute information about major topics coming before the council. I have a Twitter site and 2 Facebook sites, so stuff goes out. So I distribute information about major topics coming before the council. I report upon events in which I participate as mayor, such as this one. And I praise individuals and organizations for the good and important work they do. But I do not engage in public debate online. As Garton Ash states, recall these words, the internet is full of incitements, lies, disinformation, and hate. And I've learned that if I dive too deeply into that rabbit hole, and if I linger there too long, I risk becoming ignorant, immersed in anger and hate, and profoundly sad. So I don't do it. When debating public issues, I strive to inspire people. I don't say I succeed. I strive to inspire people. I treat everyone with respect and try to open gateways or build bridges that connect rather than divide people. My own personal strategy for doing this is dialogic, much like Jim Leach was referring to. I talk with people who seemingly are on the other side. Listen actively to what they say. Ask questions. Try to understand the story that underpins their values and beliefs. No, their beliefs and actions. Seek the emotional truth of any factually suspect claims they make. This is an interesting concept, actually, emotional truth. If somebody could ask me about it later on. Look for interests and experiences that we share. Express my own views. Hear the other's response. Restate my views in a way that takes their views and emotional truths into account, and be open to self-transformation after fully engaging the other's point of view. That's what I strive to do. I fail all the time, but I try to do that. And I don't want to sound naive. Almost 40 years ago, I found myself flying in close quarters, actually in the back left-hand part of an airplane, next to a man who had a swastika-shaped earring. I see you have a swastika hanging from your ear. I said, why do you wear it? Oh my God. I was horrified to hear his response. I won't go into detail about it. It was 40 years ago. I probably can't remember. But it was quite the thing. You know, I wanted to engage in this kind of dialogue with him. Whoa. Sometimes you don't really want to go there. So let me make my general comments a little bit more real by connecting them to one of the several controversial topics our city council has confronted over the past 5 years. Charlie Easton will recognize some of this. Where are you, Charlie? You're in the room somewhere, yeah. And some others will as well. A little over 6 months ago, the new owner of a 410-unit lower-income housing complex named Rose Oaks informed its tenants, many of whom were people of color, that the owners would be renovating the complex substantially. The tenants would have to vacate their apartments not later than the expiration dates on their leases. The announcement caught residents by surprise, not just residents. In some cases, they would have to move in a few days. Others had more time, but they all had to move. And it was very difficult for any of them to know where they could go in a context where the vacancy rate for rental units is less than 2%. The situation quickly blossomed into a contentious political issue. Hyperbolic rhetoric abounded, especially at our council meeting in early April. You know, you can watch our council meetings online, the recorded versions of them. Take a look at, I think it's the April 5th meeting. And watch how it unfolds at the very start during the public discussion period. During our meeting on June the 5th, so 2 months later, a Congolese man who lives at Rose Oaks described his family's situation. He spoke French. So we had to scurry around to find someone who could translate for him. Luckily, someone in the audience volunteered. She didn't know she was going to have to do that, but she came up and said, well, I can speak French. Je parle un peu de français, and that kind of thing. So the Congolese man told us that he and his family are refugees and that he works at one of the industrial facilities just across Highway 6 from Rose Oaks. Although he is employed, his family's income is quite low. Their children attend a nearby elementary school. Grant Wood, I think, but I'm not certain about that. But now they've been told they must move. He has no idea where they will live, whether they'll be able to afford the rent, how he will get to his job, and where his children will go to school. Like other residents, he asked the city government to help. We need public housing, he said. So I tell you this story to highlight a few key points about the situation we face here in Iowa City. First, the population of Iowa City is far more diverse than it was 20 years ago, and far more diverse than the state of Iowa as a whole. Roughly 12,000 of Iowa City's roughly 68,000 residents are either Hispanic, Black, Chinese, Korean, or subcontinental Indian. We also have large and growing populations of Sudanese and Congolese refugees. I see Adil in the room right here. For many of these new Iowa Cityans, language and cultural barriers can be formidable. Moreover, if they are African American, Muslim, Hispanic, or recently arrived refugees from Africa or the Middle East, they know that people like them have been the subject of virulent verbal attacks and are at great risk of being arrested and deported. Many of them feel threatened and silenced as a result. And if we had time, I could go into one particular story about one particular location where I think that's really palpable, but I think it would be inappropriate. It might rebound to their harm. Second, the City Council is also very aware of the need to respond effectively to tensions between the police and our Black residents. There have been several major, and incidentally, many of the people who live at Rose Oaks are African American. They're not refugees. Some are Hispanic, and so on. But many of them were African American. There have been several major public demonstrations in Iowa City over the past 4.5 years, including the protest against the 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin in Florida, the 2014 killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and most recently, the fatal shooting of Keith Scott by a Charlotte-Mecklenburg police officer in North Carolina. Although Iowa City has not been the site of any such shootings recently, their occurrences have elevated the significance of other police-community interactions here. Thus, when an Iowa City police officer was filmed forcing a Black teenager to the ground in the Lee Recreation Center right over there last June, or when an African American student reported he had been the victim of a hate crime in late April, protest ensued almost immediately, resonating with the national dialogue and national experience of events that are taking place in other cities. Third, recognition of this increased diversity and heightened tension are two key reasons why the City Council adopted a new strategic plan in March. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to do so. That new plan intends to foster a more inclusive, just, and sustainable Iowa City. And one of its key priorities is to advance social justice and racial equity. So if you're interested, I'd be happy to provide you with details about the strategic plan or about a diversity initiative process that we also use. Last, many of the city's long-standing policies and procedures were designed for conditions that differ substantially from the ones we face now. Constructed with white Iowans, professional people, and property owners in mind, many of these policies and procedures are poorly designed to facilitate the involvement of lower-income people, of people who speak a language other than English, of people who come from another culture. We've made many important changes in Iowa City government. I really hope you understand that. There have been pretty dramatic changes starting about 2 years ago and accelerating with the election of the new council, but it's been an ongoing thing. But much more remains to be done. So let me sum up. Protecting free speech and engaging in dialogue are necessary, but they are not sufficient. What can free speech mean when you are not yet able to speak or understand English? What can it mean when you do not yet understand the structure and processes of local government, which are incredibly opaque to any normal Iowa Citian, much less anyone who's newly arrived here? What can it mean when those governmental processes treat renters differently than property owners? And what can it mean when expressing your views in public might put loved ones at risk of being deported as undocumented residents? So if we want to combat hate speech and fear-mongering, if we want to build and cross bridges together, and if we want to live with diversity in our cosmopolitan world, that is, our cosmopolitan city, we need to step out of our comfort zones, talk with people who differ from ourselves, change some of our long-standing procedures, and be open to becoming something new. That's it. Thank you. I appreciate your attention. Be happy to answer any questions you have.
You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.